Hey everybody, welcome back to Hints and Guesses, my podcast. This is Kent Dobson, and I want to offer a little reflection this morning. Well, it's morning for me. It's Monday morning, and I want it to be on my theme of ancient compost, where I'm allowing the nutrients of the wisdom tradition and of the biblical stories and images and other ancient stories and images to offer nutrients to our depleted soil, our spiritually and emotionally and psychologically depleted soil of the 21st century. That's not to deride the place we find ourselves in. Who gets to have a say in the world that we show up in? But at least from my point of view, the soil is quite thin. It's prone to being windblown like the Dust Bowl, and the contemporary. I think we can feel that as contemporary people, but the contemporary solutions offered to us by mainstream culture don't seem to have the nutrients. Don't seem to be connected to what's vital and what's old and what's ancient and what's real and what's of depth and it's just one of the stances I take in the world, to be a sort of defender of the ancient ways. And hence this ongoing series, Ancient Compost. And today I want to talk about the trees are on fire. I'm going to read a little passage from Dillard, pretty famous passage, and talk a little bit about the Moses story. And if you listen to my last podcast, I sort of made a promise that I was going to make my podcast a more regular contribution. I was going to make a more regular contribution to my podcast, and in part just in response to the overwhelming support that I've been receiving from my patrons and who are supporting me on various levels and make this thing happen every time I make it, which was, once a month, generally, sometimes twice a month. But I'm going to put a little more effort into the frequency here. And also not just support from my patrons, but just people who say, hey, I like your podcast, and are willing to share it and talk about it and pass it on, and occasionally offer me some suggestions and comments and questions through my website, emailing me. So anyway, that's where things stand. And I want to talk today, I guess one of the a couple background questions would be, what makes a place sacred? And is it possible to attune ourselves to a kind of opening into the sacred, or align ourselves in such a way that the possibility of the sacred, the mysterious, the eternal, the numinous, what the Celts called a thin veil, would in fact be quite thin, and maybe even something like a portal opens up. And those are some background questions. And this particular podcast, I don't know how long I'll make it, but I hope by the end to even offer some suggestions. Occasionally, at least when I work one-on-one with people, I'll often have very simple invitations that sometimes are very specific, and also there's a sense where there are some general categories. So I want to offer some general suggestions for how to attune our awareness in such a way that the possibility of bumping into the sacred, or the gates or doors of our perception, would shift in such a way that we find ourselves in something larger. After all, that's probably the simplest definition of a transcendent experience. We transcend the ego's small plans and the ego's relatively small capacity to be attuned to what's real. And of course, we need the ego. If you've been listening to me for a while, I'm not one of those teachers that derides the ego. It's what makes us essentially human, and it just can be, and often is, too small of a story. And what an encounter with the mystery or the sacred or the transcendent does on one level is fracture or crack or open the ego, and we find ourselves in a larger world, or we find ourselves pulled down often into the underworld, or to use old biblical language, the sky is torn open and a voice from heaven whispers, and perhaps only we hear it. And something of our life is not the same. It shifts our center of gravity from the ego's center to another center of being that's closer in alignment with our own depths and with the depths of the mystery of life. So let's begin. Well, I've already begun, I suppose, but I want to read a passage from Annie Dillard. This is from a Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, and this came out in 1974, so just 2 years before I was born. So I'm dating myself here, and she's in this passage talking about one of these thin places and of a kind of transcendent experience. She goes on after this passage to describe the reality that the moment we begin to describe what's hard to describe, we lose it. It's like a vapor in the wind that we're trying to grasp, or like sand, very fine sand slipping through our fingers, that sort of thing. So here's the passage. When her doctor took her bandages off and led her into the garden, the girl was no longer blind, but saw the tree with lights in it. I mean, this is in and of itself just a fascinating sentence, a kind of childhood experience of moving from blindness to sight. And the kind of sight had a particular quality to it, that the trees had lights in it. And, it sort of reminds me as an aside of this healing story of Jesus, where it's kind of a double healing, and he puts mud on a man's eyes, and I think it's one of the mud passages. I can't quite remember off the top of my head, but let's just say he puts mud on his eyes and spits in the mud, and he asks the man, "What do you see?" And he says, "I see trees, like people walking around." And so Jesus sort of tries again, and really this story is about the failure of the disciples to perceive what's real. It's really much more about their perception of what's happening. They are like they're like the man. They're partially blind, or they partially see, and Jesus is sort of revealing this way of seeing to his disciples through this experience with the man. Of course, also the man is experiencing a kind of transformation around sight, and there's a movement from darkness to some clarity to sort of full clarity, and here she seems to see something quite mysterious. Maybe even we might guess that there's something of the tree's essence that's being seen here. And so she goes on and says, "It was for this tree I searched." So she's saying, I am this girl, and ever since this experience I've been searching. It was for this tree I searched through the peach orchards of summer, in the forests of fall, and down winter and spring for years. I don't know if you've ever had a glimpse of something that took your breath away, that leveled you, that pinned you to the earth. And just now in my memory, and to remember is to experience truth. Not that all memories are, what we would call actual events. Sometimes the memory has a way of conflating or mixing things up. But I just mean it in the old Greek sense that deep in the underworld there's a river of memory, and that's the word for truth. And so to remember is to experience the truth. And I just remembered one of my wilderness fasts, solo wilderness fasts in Utah, and day and night they're demarcated obviously by light, but the sense of time is all upside down when you're in the wilderness alone for several days, and in my case without eating, and once when the moon set, just for without any effort on my part or any thought or thinking or practice or experimentation or special religious thoughts or remembering quotations. I felt as if I was pinned to the earth by the cosmos, by the stars. It's like there was something about the sheer volume and magnitude and luminosity of what we would call the Milky Way. And there were so many stars present that for a moment, all of the constellations that I ordinarily look for or orient toward had receded into the background of the canvas of the entire cosmos, whatever was coming into my perception. And, that's the kind of thing that's so unexpected that you go looking for it. It's like every once in a while I look up when I'm awake at night and the stars are right, and I it's like that memory comes back, and it's like searching. It's like, and here she is saying, I was searching for the tree with lights in it, and then one day I was walking along Tinker Creek and thinking of nothing at all. And isn't that often how it goes? It's the place of no thought. The monkey mind quiets, and then I saw the tree with lights in it. I saw the backyard cedar where the morning doves roost, charged and transfigured, each cell buzzing with flame. I stood on the grass with the lights in it. Grass that was holy fire, like WHOLLY, and maybe also this, you hear that and you have the hint of the sacred, of holy, HOLY. I stood on the grass with the lights in it, grass that was holy fire, utterly focused and utterly dreamed. It was less like seeing than like being seen for the first time, knocked breathless by a powerful glance. Do you know what she's talking about? It's not just seeing something magnificent, but it's like something is looking back at you. A kind of consciousness or presence or quality or vitality or presence. Maybe that's the simplest word for it. After all, what is the universe but presence? And what is each individual being in a universe but presence? And even whole landscapes and certain bends in the river have a kind of presence. And every once in a while, it's like, I'm not just seeing something, but I'm being seen by something. Sometimes we have this experience with very direct animal encounters. I had a mother grizzly and her cub come into the river once where I was fishing, and there wasn't really time to move. And it's one of those situations you read about that are the most dangerous. And she looked at me in a certain way. And I can tell you that I knew she wasn't going to kill me. It was the quality of the look. And all I could do was just be present to it, to be seen like this, and to see in the way I was seeing. Anyway, the flood of fire abated, she goes on, but I'm still spending the power. It's like something in our cells just keeps recycling this kind of energy. Gradually, the lights went out in the cedar and the colors died and the cells unflamed and disappeared. I was still ringing. I had my whole life a bell and never knew it until that moment. I was lifted and struck. I have since only very rarely seen the tree with lights in it. The vision comes and goes, mostly goes, but I live for it. For the moment, the mountains open and a new light roars in spate through the crack, and the mountains slam. I want to walk through the world like this. Not manufacturing or creating or faking, but with my heart and my being open enough to the possibility of being struck like this. It's like our essence is shaped like a bell, or to use another kind of metaphor, it's like we are a tuning fork, and one fork goes right through the center of our being, and the other end of the tuning fork is the world, and sometimes something, and a moment, a tree, a cedar, the eyes of a bear 12 feet away, and the tuning fork is struck, and our whole body is alive in a way we didn't even know was possible, and we can still feel the power of those reverberations, and we live for it, to be touched by the sacred like this, by the holy, by the numinous, by the transcendent, by the fracturing of our ego, and entering into a world we didn't know was there. It's like there are worlds within worlds, and God, talk about the mystery of being, and perhaps you know a little of what I'm talking about, and sometimes it's not just the trees that are on fire, but sometimes even pain and death have this kind of luminous quality, a kind of, they're lit from within, and they're lit with a kind of meaning. It's like, yes, life is meaningful. And I'm not the agent or the manufacturer of meaning. I'm at best the interpreter, and not even a very good one at that. But what would it be like to walk in the world like this? I think, to use some Jungian language, in part, this is the religious instinct. Jung says that the religious impulse or instinct toward the sacred, toward the holy, toward the mystery is in fact an instinct like sex and food and shelter, and it's that raw and human and natural and normal, and I think that kind of craving, that kind of instinctual craving is alive like never before, and the ancient ways whisper that this is possible. And that's the story of Moses. I can't read this passage in Tinker Creek without thinking about Moses and the burning bush, the tree, the oldest story of a tree being on fire. And it's not just that Moses' tree was on fire like that's happens from time to time in the desert, hope it doesn't lead to a brush fire. It's much more like it's lit from within, and the story of Moses, I'll read just a tiny bit of it in a second, just so I can let of course I'm going to read in English, not in Hebrew, but just let as close as we can, the words do their own work. But it's intriguing to me that Moses is one of those figures that is caught between worlds. He's born Jewish but has an Egyptian name and is raised in an Egyptian household in a time where there were just the haves and the have-nots. There was not the middle class. You had the slave class, essentially, and you had the ruling class. And Moses, as a Jew, is born into the slave class. And we know from archaeology and Egyptian records, they really had their own towns and their own kind of economies and practices and rites and rituals and meals, and it was a separate society, and these worlds were very divided. And so here Moses grows up knowing he doesn't quite belong and not knowing what to do about it, and one day what rises up in him is a kind of instinctual reaction to the beating of a Jewish slave by an Egyptian, and he kills the Egyptian and is frightened for obvious reasons and runs for his life. And you might think, well, the story's over. He's out of Egypt and he's running from killing someone. And just as a little aside, this is the same character, Moses, that one day will have this experience on Mount Sinai, who will carry the tablets that say, do not commit murder. Only a murderer would know what that means and the potential that each human being has for this kind of malevolent and dark action in the world. Moses knows, and so he carries those tablets and with a kind of solemnity we can imagine. So in any case, he's starting a new career as a shepherd, and much of the biblical, much of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, revolves around shepherds, and even says in Exodus, actually in Genesis, that shepherds are detestable to Egyptians because Egyptians are sophistication and culture and permanence and pomp and circumstance and big buildings, and shepherds are nomadic, and they follow the wind and the water and their own sheep, and they're free in a way that when you finally build that big house, you're not. You're enslaved to a kind of self-protection, and so there's a kind of detesting, the ruling class detests the kind of nomadic freedom. At least that's what I'm bringing into the story, and a little bit in my imagination. And by the way, imagination is essential for reading these ancient stories. And we often don't think about that, especially if you're a Christian or we're raised religious, and we're often taught to ask, well, what does it mean, and how do I apply it, and what's the truth, what's the non-negotiable truth? And when all the while the Bible is in a way awakening our imagination, which is one of the windows of knowing, thinking, feeling, sensing, and imagination, or even intuition, we might say. And yeah, so it's when Moses is out, what he probably thinks is carrying on with the next chapter of his life, and Egypt far behind. It says Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he had led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb. This is one of the names for Mount Sinai, or the region of Mount Sinai, and the mountain of God, in other words. There, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire. Now, angels, we have 2,000 years of Christendom and Christian art to color our understanding of an angel. But if I just take the plain Hebrew, it just says messenger, and anything can be a messenger. I suppose it could be a being, a winged being, but anything that acts as a kind of messenger. And so a messenger of the Lord appeared to him in flames from within the bush. And here you can hear the probably conscious or perhaps unconscious allusions in the Dillard passage, that somehow the light is within something. And Moses saw that the bush was on fire and that it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. And already I think it's important to wonder something like, well, what kind of attention necessitates this encounter? Well, you could say, first of all, very simply, it requires a kind of attention, a quality of attention, and maybe a certain amount of emptiness and silence and quiet and sort of observation. I was suddenly remembering when I was a kid and used to hunt, and various animals and track them, and it's a kind of attention is required, where you really have to notice. Not only do you notice the external world, but you become acutely aware of the internal landscape. It's like the movements of your body and the noise that you're making and the sound of your breath and the motion of your chest, and all of which can alert the wild world to your presence. And that's what I think is interesting about this passage. It says that Moses noticed, and he thought, well, I'm going to go over and see this strange sight. So it's like the external and the internal landscape are quiet enough. It's like walking along doing nothing in particular, like Annie Dillard says, that you sort of accidentally notice just the way the world is. I suppose it's probably not all that strange to see a bush that's on fire, but in the desert, but it certainly is one that's not being consumed. And how would you know that at first? And how would you be aware that this thing is on fire but not consumed without some time, without some patience, without some attention? When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moshe, do not come any closer. Take off your shoes, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at the Lord. So talk about a fracturing of the ego's reality. Here, I'm recently married. I'm Moses here. I'm recently married. I'm got a job to do. I'm gainfully employed by my father-in-law, and I'm out wandering, doing what shepherds do, and protecting the flock and feeding the flock and sleeping with the flock, and suddenly how I thought my life should go is fractured and cracked open and flooded with a kind of luminous light and a voice that says my name. Like, I know who you are. I see you. As much as you see the bush that's on fire, but that's not being consumed, I see you. I look back. I know you, says God, says Yahweh, the God of these ancient Hebrews. And in this moment, the place is experienced as holy. And, God has to tell him, this is holy ground. This is sacred ground. You've reached the realm of the divine in an ordinary bush that's in the middle of the desert. I don't know if you've been to really deep desert. Like I've been to the deep deserts of Sinai, and the sheer vastness and silence that's present. Even a plane at 30,000 feet it will strike you as disruptive to the sheer magnificence and emptiness and liveliness of the desert itself. And that's where Moses finds himself, and he finds that thin place, the place between worlds, between the ordinary and the sacred. And one of the things that I often think about with sacred space is I think it's pretty common to say, well, all spaces are sacred. It's very Protestant in a way, and we don't need church buildings, and we don't need all those smells and bells and incense and chimes and markers and steeples and marble and mosaics, and everything is sacred. But sometimes when you say everything is sacred, it's also a way of saying, well, then nothing is sacred, and I don't encounter the sacredness of anything at all. The same with saying that everything is spiritual. It's like, well, what's the difference between that and nothing is spiritual? And how would you know when you bump into what is spiritual? And how would you know when you bump into what is not spiritual? And it seems too easy. And I think part of what human beings did this is kind of like almost an evolutionary view of religion, or a long view of religion, is when they had moments where suddenly the tree was lit from within and they were struck with the sacred and with the divine, and then they marked spots like this and they said, this happened here, and there's something about this particular place that teaches us something about the world, but not without the particularity. I first got this idea from from Pete Rollins, who was on my podcast a while back, a friend of mine. And, I just heard him say, as almost an aside, that we can't jump too quickly to the universal. We need the particular. The particular is the way in. And this particular tree and this particular patch of sand or rock or stone or granite or whatever he was standing on, and that is the place to take your shoes off and to consent to the experience that you're actually having in the moment that you're having it. It's not time for a journal entry or to put up a building, or it's to consent to the numinous. I've used that word several times, and I first heard it from Jung, but it means to wink. Those are the origins. Have you ever had the universe wink at you? It's like life is not what you thought. And it's just like a kind of gentle, I think loving, and occasionally fierce. That's my favorite combo. Love and fierceness, and it's not what you think. And sometimes we can't help but take our shoes off for the place we're standing is holy ground, and we will not be the same. We will not be the same. And perhaps like Annie Dillard, we will be on a strange and a long and winding road just to get back to that place, knowing we full well we can't conjure it up, but we can perhaps walk in a certain way with a certain kind of posture that is open to that sort of possibility. And I think it is important to honor such places. The few times where I've had something like this happen, where maybe like St. Paul, scales fell from my eyes, and I saw and I was seen just for a moment. And you want to mark it. You want to say, yeah, this was holy ground. And even if I ever, and sometimes I do, get a chance to return to just little places like that, I remember and I want to honor it. And sometimes I do. And I'll say a prayer, or, I don't know, offer a kind of gesture, or recall the story, or something like that. And I think that reaction by Moses to take the shoes off is the right kind of move. That's partly what I mean by consent, and by allowing yourself to be, confronted. And after all, you don't have to read much of the Bible to know that the divine, the mystery of the divine, who has several names and is hard to pin down, is hard to name, and is hard to know, and is, of course, culturally colored by the worldview of the ancient writers. And one thing that you can say is that it disrupts. And sometimes it's so disruptive that out of the mouth of the disruption, of the divine, of the disruptor, comes the phrase, do not be afraid. Now, if you have to say, do not be afraid, what an experience of God is like. It can strike the right kind of fear ringing through your body. Talk about a bell, talk about a tuning fork, talk about a bear looking you in the face. It's like, yeah, all right. How the body sits up in a certain way. So my point is, the divine can be a disruptor. And even a disruption of love is a kind of disruption. I mean, when was the last time you were really loved through and through? Well, that's a shocker of an event. That'll run you through like a sword. That'll prick you like the arrow of Eros, It's like Jesus at the baptism hears a voice that says, "This is my son whom I love." Maybe he had never been shot through with that kind of arrow his entire life. Maybe Joseph didn't know how to love. Joseph, after all, by the time Jesus is an adult, is MIA. We don't know what happened to him. Maybe he died, and maybe he just, I don't know, wasn't that involved. And here the divine runs Jesus through with an arrow, and that can also scare you. So I'm just, to be human is to experience the complexity of an emotional and and physiological and somatic way of being. We are complex, and love and fear and longing and desire, and they're all mixed up here. And sometimes all we can do is just take our shoes off and say, the world's not what I thought. My life is not what I thought. What's real is not what I thought was real. And what's possible is not what I thought was possible. And the course of my own life, what I thought I'd be doing, like, who knows what Moses thought? Like, I don't know. Guess I'm going to be a good shepherd. And from this point on, it's like he can't go back. It shifts his center of gravity to something else, and aligns him with a deeper purpose, and begins to give him instructions even about what's next. And go talk to Pharaoh, and here Moses has a speech impediment, and the very thing you don't want to have if you have to be a public speaker. And the course of his life begins to take on a sort of destiny. But not without this moment. And not without feeling the tension between the particular and the universal here again. We need the particular. I think one of the scariest questions you can ask is, what is my actual experience of God? It's also quite freeing. What is my actual experience of the divine, of the mystery, of the numinous? Even if you don't even know what the word God means anymore, I'd say, hey, welcome to the unknowing of God, which is just as an essential expression as the knowing of God, as the early stages of God. And God is like this, and God is like that. And the great saints and mystics and ancient voices say, and that too has to go. That too has its place, but will be taken. And so what is your particular experience like right now? And I think even offering or allowing yourself to reflect upon, well, when have you tasted what was outside? Excuse me. Wow. I'm back here after 5 minutes of coughing. Nothing like mentioning Moses's speech impediment and then being unable to speak. Yeah, God is disruptive, and even the nature of our own life is disruptive. And and here my voice is wavering. Talk about being human here. I'm thinking about my dad. It's like my dad died of ALS, and one of the horrible things among 75 others is that for most people, their voice is taken. Sometimes that's the first to go. And I think for my dad too, I mean, he made a living, much like I am doing, using his voice. And talk about mirroring back to him and to me, even in this moment, in a very small and minor way. Who are you beneath your voice? Kind of the voice beneath the voice, if there is such a thing. And who are you without the persona and the masks that you put on and that give you a sense of identity and a role and a place and a name? And that's like being confronted. And it's like God saying, Moshe, like Moses, listen to me. We could even wonder, it's sort of like, what the hell are you doing out here? Who do you think you are? What do you think your life is about? What are you hiding from and running from? It's sort of like that. And sometimes life will just do it to you. And sometimes it's quite tragic, like with my dad. And you have to begin to look for the deeper streams, the deeper wells. Otherwise, I don't know, it's like When we're too identified with the external form, it's a terrifying place. So anyway, back to the story here, and I think I was wrestling with the particular and the universal, and we need those particular places. We need to find moments where we've learned to take our shoes off, and what that does is open us up to a universe. And this is what I got from Pete Rollins. We need to have a burning bush experience to know that all the trees are on fire. And I for one think, I don't believe in a kind of higher level plane of enlightenment that you can just live full time knowing and experiencing and tasting that everything is on fire, that every tree is on fire, that every moment and every breath and every being you meet is radiating from within. I think personally it's much more like Annie Dillard, that it goes more than it comes, and maybe that's just part of our humanness, part of our deep human nature, that we can taste and know and experience the numinous and the transcendent, and we also know what it's like to just be very ordinary and cough in the middle of trying to make a podcast and take out the trash and pay bills, and I think an experience of the numinous does begin to color the ordinary. And perhaps what happens over time is more and more and more of the ordinary begins to glow from within. And so maybe I just want to mention a few things. I didn't want this podcast to be too long. Just a practice. And before I give you this practice, I want to quote some James Finley, which I've probably done before on Hints and Guesses. But Finley says, you cannot make the moment of oceanic oneness happen. So I'll interpret. You cannot make the tree, you can't light the tree on fire from within. You can't do it. You can't make the moment of oceanic oneness happen. Just like if you, it's kind of like dating, you try too hard, it's not going to work, but you have to try some. So he says, you cannot make the moment of oceanic oneness happen, but you can offer the stance of least resistance. Something like that. I might not get the quote exactly, but that's the nature of it, the gist of it. You cannot make the moment of oceanic oneness happen, but you can offer the path of least resistance. If I remember, I'll give you one more James Finley quote, one of my all-time favorites, right at the end. Let me jot it down so I don't forget. Okay. So here's a practice. It's a practice that involves attention. And it's one that I do regularly. And it's like I need to listen to my own podcast to remind me to go out and be in the world in a certain way. And we get hints from Annie Dillard saying that she wandered among trees in all seasons with a kind of a longing and a kind of hope and a kind of craving. And so this is a wandering practice, and it looks a little something like this. Go out to a wild place and wander. And when I say wander, I mean really just that. Not like destination necessarily, not like I need to climb to the top of something, which is often my impulse, but to really wander and even to be surprised where we might encounter the wild. But what counts as a wild place? And if you go to a park nearby, and where does the wild begin? And where is that place? And how do you know when you're in it? And that's what I mean by wandering, just opening up to the world. And the simplest thing you can do is begin to, almost like a kind of internal Rolodex, go through your five senses and really all five, What do I see? And walk for a while, really bringing attention to what you see and shifting that to what you hear, any order, it doesn't matter, and smelling and tasting and your senses, the feel of the bark of a tree, and touch, and maybe even going through the cycle here several times. Just, man, when was the last time you really allowed yourself to bring conscious attention to what's happening all the time, to the nature of your own experience, your five senses? And maybe if with a little luck, you can open up more than one sense at a time. And it's possible to wander with all five senses, and with a kind of a conscious attention to your five senses, and allowing the actual experience that you're having to shape you and to speak to you, and allow yourself to be drawn. This is the next really part of the practice here. I first learned practices like this. I'm sort of coloring it a bit with my own way of putting things, from Animas Valley Institute, from my guide training program out there, and from the many experiences that I've been on. Often, much of what happens for people happens out on wanders. And so, yeah, you're wandering as if the world is alive, and as if you're offering a posture of least resistance to the way things are. And you might want to allow yourself to be drawn to a place. And it could be anything at all, a certain stone or a stump, or the way the moss is covering the forest floor, or another, animal or bird or snake, or who knows. And you'll know when you feel drawn, because you feel drawn, and you're walking in such a way that you're much more fully in tune with your own humanness. And and when you find yourself drawn to a place, notice what you see, or notice the fullness of what you're able to perceive, and what's happening in you. It's that conversation between the external and the internal, like I described in the Moses story. And, well, what is this strange sight? And what bodily sensations am I having? And what do I notice? And sometimes it can be helpful to even speak to a place. I will often do this, especially if nobody's around. And I suppose if somebody is around, they'll just think, oh, there's a crazy person talking in the woods, and that would be me. Yeah, and I might say a few things about what I notice and what strikes me about the way the light moves through the canopy, through the leaf canopy, or whatever. I don't know, whatever it is that I'm noticing. And here's a question you would begin to carry. What relationship is emerging here? How or in what ways or in what fashion am I related to the other? What is the quality of the relationship? What do I sense is the quality of the relationship? After all, we know this from a scientific point of view, deeply interwoven and interrelated. And most people, like me, like saying that. But many of us have very little experience in knowing and tasting and feeling the ways in which we're interwoven. And yet it's right there within the realm of possibility. Maybe there's a certain quality to the relationship that you feel in a particular place. You might even feel like taking your shoes off. I'm not saying go and manufacture this, but it can help. It's like, wait, what am I experiencing here? And sometimes you might even get a little hint about the nature of the relationship and how you might respond. It's just like when you fall in love. It's a relational dynamic that shape shifts who we are, who we think we are, and it's as much responsive as it is. I don't know, the opposite. reminding ourselves that we're not trying to make anything happen. What are we doing? We're just out wandering in a wild place, trying to feel what it is to be who we are, and offering ourselves in a certain kind of posture to the world as it is, and to be drawn to a place, and to deepen the quality of our relationship with a place, and to respond to a place in the way that seems right and fitting. And it's not like if you go out and do what I'm describing, the cedar tree will be lit from within, or out of the burning silver maple, a voice will speak to you. But sometimes something like that happens, and probably when we're not trying too hard. And whatever happens, what consciousness am I going to bring to that? This is what's happening for me. And you might notice all kinds of things like your boredom, or your thought patterns, or embarrassingly, I was telling someone the other day on one of my vision fasts, and I remember just right in the middle of the day, for a long stretch of the day, working on my resume in my head until I became conscious of, oh my God, I'm working on my resume, like the whole world is on fire, and I'm worried about my CV, because the ego can be that possessive of our consciousness. And so you're noticing perhaps that, and letting that go, but not just letting it go in a deep meditative stance where you're letting all things go, but you're letting that go, and in this case, entering into your senses and into the body and into what's happening for you. And maybe a certain amount of faith is involved that to walk in the world like this is the right kind of posture, and is to be a little closer to the sacred way of walking and the ancient way of walking, and the possibility of bumping into the holy, and stumbling onto holy ground. And don't you want to walk like this through life? Or to quote Mary Oliver, do you only want to, what does she say? I don't want to end up having only visited this world. Yeah, me too. I don't want to be a visitor. I want to be a participant. I want to be a relational participant in the mystery of life, and in the mystery of my own life, and to the best of my very human and frail way. So that's the practice. That's the very simple practice, to wander in a wild place, and to really wander within your five senses, and to allow yourself to be drawn to something out in the wild world, and to notice what you notice, and to deepen into the emerging relationship that is happening in the moment, and to respond in kind, and allow yourself to be shaped by the experience as much as you are shaping the world just by your own presence. And to deepening that craving to walk a certain way, to have a certain quality of attention toward what's ultimately real and true and beautiful and meaningful. So, all right, as promised, I'm going to end with a James Finley quote, one of the best of all times. So, how might you go about this? How might you go about any spiritual practice, you might say, or if you don't like the word spiritual, practice. How might you go about this? Well, he says, quit trying. Okay, well, quit trying. Quit trying not to try. Okay. Quit trying not to try. Quit trying. Quit trying not to try. And then he says, quit quitting. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks for tuning in.